I always knew my stepmother had a way of making things hers, whether they belonged to her or not. When my mom passed away, it felt like everything she touched slowly disappeared into my stepmother's grasp. Her place in the house, her favorite spots in the garden, even the way my father started calling her by the same pet names he once used for my mom. But nothing stung more than what happened to my mom's jewelry. I was 22 when my mother passed away, and in the weeks that followed, I couldn't bring myself to go through her things. I left it all in the hands of my father, trusting that he would know what to do, how to keep the most important pieces safe. I assumed, naively, that the jewelry, the delicate gold bracelet she never took off, the sapphire pendant that sparkled against her skin, and most of all, her engagement ring, would be waiting for me when I was ready. But when I finally asked about it a year later, my father's answer left me cold. "Your stepmother has it," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "She thought it would be best if she held onto it for safekeeping." Safekeeping? The word echoed in my mind like a bad joke. My stepmother, Diane, was the kind of woman who made sure everyone knew what was hers, especially when it wasn't. She moved into our house less than a year after my mother passed, and from the moment she walked through the door, it felt like the air changed. Suddenly, family dinners were filled with her opinions, holiday traditions were reshaped to fit her tastes, and my father, who once clung to every memory of my mom, began to act as if she had been a distant relative instead of his wife of 25 years. Diane never outright said the jewelry was hers, but I noticed the way she started wearing my mom's pieces, a bracelet here, a pair of earrings there. And one day, I saw it, the ring, the very ring my mom wore every single day of her marriage to my dad. It was a simple gold band with a modest diamond, nothing flashy, but it meant everything to me. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it was a piece of my mom. And there it was, sparkling on Diane's hand as she casually stirred her coffee. When I asked about it, her response was casual, almost bored. "Oh, this? Your father gave it to me. He said it would look better on someone who would actually wear it." I remember standing there, speechless, a lump forming in my throat. My father, sitting across from her, wouldn't meet my eyes. And Diane, with that smug little smile of hers, twisted the ring around her finger like it had always belonged there. I tried to tell myself it didn't matter, that a ring was just a ring, and what mattered were the memories I had of my mom, not the things she left behind. But late at night, when I was alone with my thoughts, it gnawed at me. It wasn't just about the jewelry. It was about everything Diane had taken. My space, my father's attention, the last tangible reminders of my mom. I spent years trying to let it go. After all, what could I do? My father was wrapped around Diane's little finger, and every time I brought it up, he brushed it off with a dismissive, "Diane deserves to feel like part of the family." But deep down, I knew the truth. Diane didn't just want to be part of the family. She wanted to erase any trace of my mother entirely. And with my father too blind to see it, I had no choice but to watch it happen. Still, a part of me refused to let go completely. I started digging, looking through old storage boxes, hoping to find anything my mom left behind that Diane hadn't claimed. And that's when I stumbled upon a dusty folder tucked away in the back of my father's office closet. Inside, among old papers and forgotten bills, was something I never expected to find: my mother's will. My hands trembled as I flipped through the crisp, yellowing pages of my mother's will. I could hardly believe what I was looking at. There it was, in black and white, every single piece of my mother's jewelry, including her engagement ring, had been left to me. Not my father, not Diane. Me. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I read the lines over and over, my eyes scanning the legal jargon until they landed on the words that mattered most. All jewelry, including sentimental pieces, to be inherited by my daughter. For years I had let Diane take and take, believing that maybe I had no real claim to the things that once belonged to my mom. But this was proof that I had been right all along, that my mother's ring, The one Diane so proudly flaunted on her hand was mine. I didn't even hesitate. I clutched the will tightly and marched downstairs, where my father and Diane were lounging in the living room. My father was reading the newspaper, oblivious as always, while Diane scrolled through her phone, that cursed ring glinting in the afternoon sunlight. "I need to talk to you," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. My father glanced up, his brow furrowing, but it was Diane who spoke first. "Oh? What now?" she asked, barely looking at me. I stepped forward, holding up the will. "I found Mom's will," I said, watching as Diane's eyes finally snapped to mine. "And guess what? She left all of her jewelry to me. Not to Dad. Me." For the first time in a long while, I saw something flicker across Diane's face. Fear. She quickly covered it up with a laugh, the kind that always made my skin crawl. "Oh, sweetie," she said, sitting up straighter. "That's just so long ago. Things change. Your dad gave me this ring because he wanted me to have it. Sentimental value and all." I looked at my father, pleading silently for him to back me up. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, avoiding my gaze. It's just a ring, honey," he muttered. "Diane wears it because she took it," I interrupted, my voice sharp. "And it's not just a ring, Dad. It was Mom's, and she wanted me to have it." Diane's smile tightened. "You're being greedy," she said, her tone laced with fake sweetness. "Your mother would have wanted the family to enjoy her things, not let them sit in a box somewhere." "Greedy?" I repeated, feeling my anger bubble to the surface. "Wanting what's legally mine is not greedy." She waved a hand dismissively. "Well, if you're going to make such a fuss about it, why don't we see what your father thinks?" She turned to him, and I saw the hesitation in his eyes. "Right, darling?" I held my breath, watching the man who was supposed to stand up for me falter yet again. "Diane's been wearing it for years," he said softly. "It's just, I didn't think it was a big deal." I felt a sharp sting in my chest, but I refused to back down. "It is a big deal, and I want it back." Diane sighed, tapping her nails against the arm of the couch. "Fine," she said, rolling her eyes. "If it means that much to you, we'll figure something out. But I think it's pretty childish, honestly." I clenched my fists at my sides. "I'll give you a chance to do the right thing, Diane," I said through gritted teeth. "But if you don't, I'll take legal action." Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second before she plastered on another fake smile. "There's no need for that," she said quickly. "We're family, after all." I didn't trust her one bit. But one thing was clear, I wasn't going to let her win this time. The tension in the house became unbearable after that confrontation. Diane might have played it off with her usual fake sweetness, but I could see the anger simmering beneath her carefully composed exterior. And my father, well, he did what he always did, sat quietly on the sidelines, too afraid to upset his wife. I knew Diane wasn't going to give up the jewelry without a fight. She wasn't the kind of woman who gave up anything easily, let alone something she'd paraded around for years as if it were hers. But I wasn't backing down either. My mother's will was clear, and for once in my life, I had the law on my side. The next morning, I walked downstairs and found Diane in the kitchen, sipping her coffee like she didn't have a care in the world. My mother's ring still sparkled on her finger, catching the morning sunlight. The sight of it made my blood boil. "I'd like to take Mom's jewelry today," I said, standing in the doorway, arms crossed. Diane didn't even look up. She just stirred her coffee slowly and smiled. "Oh, honey," she said with that same condescending tone that made me want to scream. "I thought we agreed to talk things through like adults. No need to be so pushy." "I'm not being pushy. I'm asking for what's mine." She sighed dramatically and set her mug down with a clink. "Well, if you must know, I've misplaced some of the pieces," she said, feigning a sad expression. "I mean, it's been years, dear. Things get lost. I'll have to look for them." My jaw clenched. I knew she was lying through her teeth. "Diane, I'm not stupid. I want the jewelry by the end of the day." She gave me a pitying look, like I was a child throwing a tantrum. "You're so emotional about this," she said, standing up and brushing past me. "It's not very becoming." I gritted my teeth and let her walk away. Fighting with her directly wasn't going to get me anywhere. I needed a different approach. That afternoon, I decided to take things a step further. I booked a consultation with a lawyer, someone who could give me solid advice on how to handle this legally. I wasn't going to let Diane manipulate the situation anymore. The lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Ms. Grant, listened intently as I laid everything out: the will, the stolen jewelry, and Diane's refusal to return it. "Well," Ms. Grant said, leaning back in her chair, "you have a strong case. The will is legally binding, and if the jewelry was intended for you, your stepmother has no right to keep it. We can start by sending her a formal demand letter." A demand letter. The idea sent a thrill through me. "And if she ignores it?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "Then we escalate." I left the office that day feeling lighter than I had in years. Diane might think she could outmaneuver me with her manipulations, but she was in for a rude awakening. The letter arrived a week later, and from the moment Diane opened it, the atmosphere in the house shifted. She stormed into the living room, waving the letter like it was some personal attack. "Are you serious?" she spat, her face flushed with anger. "You got a lawyer involved? Over jewelry?" My father, who had been dozing in his chair, sat up with a frown. "What's going on?" I stood my ground. "Yes, I did. Because it's mine, Diane. And if you won't return it willingly, I'll take legal action." Diane's lips curled into a sneer. "This is ridiculous. You're being petty, you know that? Your mother wouldn't want you to tear the family apart over this." I crossed my arms. "My mother would want me to have what she left for me, and you know it." Diane's eyes darted to my father, silently pleading for support, but he just sighed and looked away. For once, he wasn't jumping to defend her. "I need some time to think," she finally said, her voice quieter but no less sharp. "I don't respond well to threats." "It's not a threat, Diane," I replied. "It's a promise." Over the next few days, Diane tried every trick in the book. First, it was guilt. She cornered me in the hallway one evening, her eyes wide with mock hurt. "Do you really want to do this? Drive a wedge between us? Your father and I? We've worked so hard to keep this family together." I stared at her, unimpressed. "You mean you've worked hard to take over this family?" Next came the manipulation. She played the victim to everyone who would listen. "Can you believe it?" she whispered to my aunt over coffee. "She's treating me like some kind of thief after everything I've done for her." But the best came later, when she finally tried to turn my father against me completely. One night, I overheard her in the kitchen, whispering to him in that sugary sweet voice she used when she wanted something. "She's being unreasonable, don't you think? Going to lawyers, threatening legal action. It's just jewelry, for heaven's sake." My father sighed heavily, and for a moment I worried he'd cave again. But then, to my surprise, he said, "It's not just jewelry to her, Diane. It's her mother's." For the first time in a long while, I felt hope. Maybe he was finally starting to see what I had known all along. Diane wasn't just keeping the jewelry. She was holding on to a piece of power she had no right to. By the time Diane realized I wasn't backing down, her mask started to slip. She snapped at me one morning when I asked if she had found the jewelry yet. "Fine!" she shrieked, throwing her hands in the air. "You want your precious jewelry? Take it. But don't come crying to me when you realize it's just a bunch of useless old trinkets." I stood there, stunned for a moment, before walking up to her with my head held high. "I'll take it, and trust me, Diane, they're worth more than you'll ever understand." That evening, she handed over a small dusty box with a huff, muttering under her breath the whole time. My fingers trembled as I opened it, and there they were, my mother's treasures. The bracelet, the pendant, and finally, the engagement ring. Seeing them again, I felt an overwhelming wave of emotion wash over me. As I held the ring in my hand, Diane gave one last bitter laugh. "Happy now?" I looked her straight in the eye. "More than you'll ever know." Diane thought she had won. Even after she grudgingly handed over my mother's jewelry, I could see it in the way she carried herself, the smug smirk that tugged at the corners of her mouth, the way she whispered to my father when she thought I wasn't looking. She still believed she had the upper hand, that I'd taken back a few pieces of metal and stones, but she still controlled the narrative. She was wrong. I wasn't done yet. After reclaiming the jewelry, I decided to have it appraised, not just for its value, but for my own peace of mind. A part of me couldn't shake the feeling that Diane might have done something underhanded. And I was right. The appraiser, an elderly gentleman with sharp eyes and an even sharper wit, took his time examining each piece carefully. When he reached the engagement ring, he paused, frowning as he held it under his magnifying glass. "This setting, it's not original," he murmured. My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" He glanced at me over his glasses. "The diamond in this ring, it's been swapped out." I felt like the floor had just vanished beneath me. "What?" I whispered, leaning forward. He nodded gravely. "The stone that's in here now? It's not the one that was originally set in this ring. The cut, the quality, it's different. Cheaper. Someone replaced it." My hands clenched into fists, rage bubbling inside me like a volcano ready to erupt. Diane. She had taken my mother's most treasured possession and gutted it, replacing the beautiful diamond my father had given with something of lesser value, all while flaunting it around like it was hers. I stormed home that evening, the ring burning a hole in my pocket, and found Diane in the living room, perched on the couch with a glass of wine in hand. She looked up lazily when I entered, her eyes narrowing slightly when she saw my expression. "I know what you did," I said, holding up the ring. "You thought you could get away with it, didn't you?" Diane set down her glass with an exaggerated sigh. "Oh, for heaven's sake, what now?" she drawled, rolling her eyes. "I gave you the jewelry. What more do you want?" I marched over and dropped the ring onto the coffee table in front of her. "You swapped the diamond," I said, my voice trembling with fury. "You stole from me. You stole from my mom." For a second, something flickered in her eyes, panic. Then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by her usual cool indifference. "That's ridiculous," she said, picking up the ring and examining it as if she had no idea what I was talking about. "You're being dramatic." I snatched it back before she could pull any more tricks. "I had it appraised, Diane. Don't bother lying." My father walked in at that moment, rubbing his temples like he already regretted stepping into the room. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice tired. I turned to him, holding the ring up. "Dad, did you know? Did you know she replaced Mom's diamond with a fake?" He blinked, his gaze flickering from me to Diane. "What? No, that can't be right." Diane let out a short, bitter laugh. "Oh, come on, you can't seriously believe this nonsense," she said, standing up and smoothing down her blouse. "Your daughter has always had a flair for the dramatic." I stepped closer to my father, my voice softening. "Dad, think about it. Mom's ring, she wore it every day. She loved it. Do you really think she would have wanted this? Diane stole from us, from me." My father looked torn, his eyes darting between us. And then, finally, something shifted in him. He sighed deeply, his shoulders slumping in a way that told me he already knew the answer, even if he didn't want to admit it. "Diane," he said quietly, did you do it?" Diane's face hardened. "You're seriously questioning me? After everything I've done for you?" But my father wasn't backing down this time. "Answer her." Diane's lips pursed, and for the first time I saw cracks in her perfect facade. "Fine," she snapped. "Yes, I replaced the damn diamond, but what does it matter? It's just a ring. It's not like she even wore it anymore." A sharp silence fell over the room. My father looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time, and for once I saw regret in his eyes. "You had no right," he said, his voice low and firm. Diane huffed, folding her arms. "Oh, grow up. She's been acting like I stole a kingdom from her. It's a stupid piece of jewelry." I took a deep breath, standing my ground. "It's not just jewelry. It's everything that was left of Mom, and you took it like you take everything else. My father's voice cut through the tension. Give her everything, now. Diane's mouth fell open. You can't be serious. I am. With a glare that could melt steel, Diane stomped upstairs. A few minutes later, she returned with a small velvet pouch and practically threw it at me. There. Happy now? I opened it, my fingers trembling, and there it was, my mother's original diamond, separate from the setting, as if it had been discarded like trash. Tears burned my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I turned to my father, the disappointment in his face so raw it made my chest ache. I hope you finally see what she really is. Diane let out a bitter laugh, grabbing her purse. I don't have to put up with this, she spat, storming toward the door. I'll be at my sister's. The door slammed behind her, and for the first time in years, the house felt lighter. My father sank into a chair, running a hand down his face. I'm sorry, he said softly. I should have done something sooner. I placed the diamond back into the pouch carefully. It's not too late, Dad, I said, but I'm done letting her take anything else from me. And with that, I walked out of the room, my mother's legacy finally fully back in my hands. In the days that followed, the house felt quieter. Diane's absence was a relief I hadn't realized I needed, and for the first time in years, I could breathe without feeling like I was walking on eggshells. My father spent most of his time in his study, avoiding eye contact whenever we passed each other in the hall, but I knew he was thinking about everything that had happened. I sat in my room, holding my mother's ring in my hands, the original diamond now safely restored in its rightful place. I traced the smooth gold band with my fingers, feeling the weight of it, both physically and emotionally. It wasn't just jewelry, it was a piece of my history, a piece of her. For so long, I had let Diane make me feel like I was asking for too much, like my mother's memory didn't belong to me. But holding the ring now, I knew I had been right to fight for it. Later that evening, my father finally knocked on my door. Can I come in? He asked, his voice hesitant. I nodded, setting the ring down carefully on my nightstand. He stepped inside, looking around my room like he hadn't been there in years. I could see the guilt etched into his face, the way his shoulders slumped slightly. I should have stopped her, he said finally, his voice heavy with regret. I should have listened to you from the beginning. I sighed, not wanting to rehash the pain, but I couldn't deny the truth. Yeah, you should have. I met his gaze, and for once he didn't look away. But you didn't. He nodded slowly, running a hand through his graying hair. I guess I was afraid of being alone, he admitted. After your mom passed, I just wanted someone to fill the void. Hearing him say it out loud made something in me soften, but it didn't erase the hurt. Mom wasn't replaceable, I said gently, and neither was what she left behind. I know, he murmured, his eyes drifting to the ring on my nightstand. I let Diane take too much from both of us. There was nothing else to say. We sat there in silence for a long moment, the weight of everything settling between us like an old wound that had finally been exposed. Eventually, he reached out and gave my hand a squeeze. A small gesture, but one that spoke volumes. Diane didn't come back, not that I expected her to. She sent a few passive-aggressive texts to my father, mostly trying to guilt him into letting her return, but for once, he stood his ground. It's better this way, he told me one afternoon. And I agreed. I started going through my mother's things properly, now that I didn't have to worry about Diane lurking around every corner. I found old letters, photographs, and little keepsakes she'd tucked away in boxes. It felt like reconnecting with her in a way I hadn't been able to since she passed, and it brought me a kind of peace I hadn't realized I needed. A few weeks later, I wore the ring out for the first time. It felt strange at first, heavy with meaning, but as I glanced down at it throughout the day, I realized how right it felt on my finger. I wasn't just wearing a piece of jewelry, I was carrying a part of my mother with me, a part that no one could ever take away again. My father and I were still rebuilding our relationship. There were scars that wouldn't fade overnight, but we were trying. He made an effort to be more present, more involved in my life, and while I wasn't ready to forgive everything just yet, I could see he was trying. And for now, that was enough. One afternoon, as we sat on the porch drinking coffee, he looked over at me and smiled softly. "Your mother would be proud of you, you know," he said. I smiled back, feeling the warmth of those words settle deep in my chest. I know. And for the first time in a long time, I really did. A year later, I stood at my mother's grave, the cool autumn breeze rustling the leaves around me. I traced my fingers over her name, etched into the stone, the weight of the past year settling in my chest. "I got it back, Mom," I whispered, holding up my hand so the ring caught the light. "It's where it belongs now." I could almost hear her voice, soft and reassuring, telling me she always knew I'd find my strength. Life had changed in so many ways since Diane left. My father and I were closer now, not perfect, but better. He was learning to stand on his own again, and I was finally stepping out of the shadow Diane had cast over our lives. I looked down at the ring, feeling a deep sense of peace I hadn't known in years. "I miss you," I said, blinking back tears, "but I think you'd be proud." With one last glance, I turned and walked away, knowing I was finally free.